Chapter 24 of Remembering Survival in a Nazi Slave Labor Camp. This chapter is called From Strachowitz to Birkenau, and it's narrated by Carter Banks, written by Christopher R. Browning. Chapter 24. The distance from Strachowitz to Auschwitz is less than 140 miles by rail. Stopping in Czestochowa, as well as for priority trains along the way, the transport apparently took about 36 hours, leaving around sunset on Friday night and arriving in the dark early Sunday morning. While waiting in Czestochowa, one man learned from a Polish train worker that their destination was Auschwitz. Not surprisingly, survivors offered widely varying estimates of how long the trip lasted, and virtually every survivor remembered it as having taken much longer than it actually did. Most often estimating between 3 and 5 days. As one survivor observed, whatever the actual time, it seemed like an eternity. But if their memories of the length of the journey vary, their memories of the horrific conditions are virtually uniform. They traveled without food or water, or at best with one bucket of water and an additional bucket for human waste. In any case, the cars were packed too tightly for anyone to get to the ladder. These late July days were sunny, and the heat within the closed cars was stifling. With just 2 tiny windows in each car, the prisoners gasped for air in the suffocating stench and heat. In several of the women's cars, there was panic and hysteria. In one case, at least, fighting broke out between girls. There were also some deaths, especially among the children and older people. Only one woman survivor remembers Poles bringing water to her car at one stop. 2 other women remember receiving some help from Germans. One woman was singing a German song at night when the train had stopped, and a Wehrmacht soldier passing by asked who was singing. He returned with 2 halves of a cabbage, which he pushed through the small window and then shared with others. Chanka Locks, who had worked in the camp office before the evacuation, had been approached by one of the military policemen, or canary birds, who was searching for an envelope. Chanka, from a relatively well-to-do family, had been the only Jewish girl from Strachowitz to be admitted to a private high school in Radom, where she had studied French. Since the military police spoke with a French accent, Chanka conversed with him in French. Subsequently, during a stop on the trip, he searched the women's cars, asking for the girl who spoke French. Finding her, he allowed Chanka and several others to make several trips with a bucket to fetch water from a well. Before the last trip, Chanka recalled, "He said, 'Listen to what I'm going to tell you. The 3 of you, just run away. I'm going to pretend I don't see you. I'll shoot later, just go.' Chanka continued, 'I didn't trust him, and we came back. Lots of times the Germans played games. I thought he'd shoot. Then he appeared again bringing us food, and then he told me, said, 'I'm sorry. I gave you a chance to run away. I'm sorry that you didn't take it. I'm sorry that you didn't take a chance, because where you are going, you're not coming back.' He had a bottle of liquor he gave to me, with name Leo Bernard and address on the French border. 'If you ever run away, I'll help you.' Years later, she wrote to Bernard, but the letter came back as undeliverable. In the open men's cars at the end of the train, the trip was made without food or water, but also without fatalities. Though the open cars had boards laid over the top on which a guard stood, and the prisoners had to sit during the entire trip to prevent escape attempts, they were aware of how lucky they were in comparison with the men in the closed cars. In those cars, the heat and suffocating lack of air dominated a struggle to survive. 19-year-old Ruben Zakronovitsky was very lucky to find a place beside the small window for fresh air at the beginning of the trip. He received several beatings from people who were desperate to get near the window, and he finally pushed away and lost his place. He became so dizzy and weak that he could not remember what happened thereafter, other than that 15 people had died in his car by the time they reached Birkenau. Aaron Arbeiter estimated that 150 prisoners had been packed into his car, and that 3 passed out and were dead when they arrived. Abram Jakubowicz noted that with the terrible heat and no food or drink, the older people in particular could not take it, and 8 to 10 people perished in his car. Maurice Weinberger remembers protesting to Becker as he was being driven into a car overfilled with 120 to 150 men. Becker kicked him and threatened to shoot him for his impotence. In his car, 27 men suffocated during the trip. Joseph Coase estimated that 120 men were loaded into his car. In that unbelievable heat without food or water, men struggled to get near the window. To me, it seemed like a madhouse. Everything seemed to get wild. Bitter fights broke out over nothing. Were we in hell? Here the dying, there the unconscious, the screamers, those flailing wildly about. It was a huge relief for us when we finally arrived at Birkenau, the gassing camp of Auschwitz. Better already dead than to perish in such a death house. In our car, out of 120 men, 30 were dead. Neither Maurice Weinberger nor Joseph Coase, who reported respectively 27 and 30 dead in their train car, said enough to identify whether they were in the same ill-fated car. But the likelihood is very great, since 7 other witnesses also noted a high fatality rate of between 20 and 30 in one of the men's train cars in particular. One of these witnesses was the nephew of the head of the kitchen, who said that his uncle Rubenstein perished in that particular car. 2 were members of the Lublin contingent, who said that 25 or 27 dead were taken from their car. Yet another identified that particular one as the first car in the train, into which the camp leadership had been loaded and did not survive. Indeed, among the dead when the train arrived in Birkenau were the head of the camp police, Jeremiah Wilczek, and his younger son, 17-year-old Chiel, as well as young Kale Rubenstein, the man whom Wilczek had appointed head of the camp kitchen, and a number of other prominenten of the Wilczek clique. Had they, like so many others, perished from dehydration, heat, prostration, and suffocation? Or did the especially high fatality rate among the camp leadership traveling in the first car signify something more sinister? In the very earliest testimony of August 1945, Mendel Kach, when complaining that the camp's elite had enriched itself at the prisoners' expense, noted cryptically, later they were punished with the death they deserved. He promised to return to the matter, but his account ended abruptly with the daylight breakout attempts on the day before the evacuation, and a fuller explanation was never given. None of the other early testimonies even mentioned Wilczek's death, much less the circumstances surrounding it. In the mid-1960s, when German investigators began interviewing survivors to assemble evidence against Becker, several witnesses explained Wilczek's death as yet another matter for which Becker should be held legally responsible. Matthias Finkelstein told the investigators that Becker had conducted the loading of the train and especially sought out the prominent Jews and put them in a closed car packed with 120 prisoners. Matthias Finkelstein's own car was not nearly as crowded, and there also had been open cars in which no one suffocated. Thus, the 18 prominentum who died on the way to Auschwitz had been, in effect, killed by Becker. Herz Tenenbaum likewise accused Becker of crowding twice as many men into the closed cars as opposed to the open ones, above all the camp elders, camp leader, and camp police, in which many, allegedly 90%, a vast exaggeration, died from the heat. At the same time, the investigators also heard a different version of events. Dena Rabinowitz, a daughter of the Wiersbennik rabbi, remembered that a man named Rubinstein, as well as the head of the camp police, Wilczek, had been killed in a train car en route to Auschwitz, though she did not say how many or by whom. And another one of the rabbi's daughters, Raka Rabinowitz, noting the large number of dead in the train cars upon their arrival in Auschwitz, added that in the men's cars, in any case, some prisoners were said to have killed others. For example, especially members of the camp administration were said to have been killed. Mayor Gutmann, who had escaped in the nighttime breakout, confirmed that he had heard after the war that a policeman and his son had been killed by other prisoners. In subsequent interviews, survivors were obviously reluctant to confirm in front of the German investigators a story that would shift blame for at least some Jewish deaths from the Germans to fellow Jews, and therefore acquit Becker of responsibility. Only one further witness stated outright that Wilczek and Rubinstein had been strangled by other Jewish prisoners in the train car on the way to Auschwitz. Another specifically singled out Becker for blame. At the loading for Auschwitz, Becker sought out people whom he knew particularly well. For example, people who had given him gifts, members of the Jewish Council, or people who had special functions in the camp. He had them locked in a closed car, pressed together as tightly as possible. On the trip to Auschwitz, many died. Among them were the camp police, Jeremiah Sick, Wilczek, and his son. But most were vague. Some merely confirmed that Wilczek and Rubinstein had died on the trip without specifying how. Others referred to the altercations and trampling in the overcrowded car carrying the camp prominenten and remarked that many did not arrive alive in Auschwitz. Two witnesses conceded that the camp leaders had all been crowded into one car, which prisoners had killed one another. But all these testimonies were hearsay. The German investigators stopped pursuing the issue entirely when, in 1967, they heard from one witness, Ben Lant, who had actually ridden in the first car. We were between 104 and 120 men, locked in a sealed cattle car, and received neither food nor water during the journey. Because it was the height of the summer in 1944, it was very hot, and the air holes in the car were too small to supply enough air for so many people. In our car, there were 20 dead upon arrival in Auschwitz. But it is not true, and this I want to declare emphatically, that the men had killed one another. I would say that most died from lack of air. Ben Lant's emphatic denial notwithstanding, in 1991, two survivors independently gave accounts that lifted the veil on the fate of Wilczek and other camp leaders on the train to Auschwitz. In a barely audible and technically flawed videotaped testimony, one survivor was explaining the tensions and conflict that arose between the camp council controlled by Wilczek and the Strachowitz old-timers and the newly arrived young men from Majdanek, the Lubliners, or Nelks. In conclusion, she noted almost as an aside that the Lubliners killed 20 of the camp elite on the train to Auschwitz. Perhaps taken aback by the realization that she had said something that she had not intended, she paused and then said with resignation, that too was also a part of history. In a retaping of her interview 18 months later, she did not repeat the story. In the same year, 1991, Goldie Sacher-Kalib published her memoir, The Last Selection, A Child's Journey Through the Holocaust. Her father, through contact with his boyhood friend Shlomo Einesman of the Wiersbennik Judenrat and later of the Camp Council, had been able to obtain work papers for his family before the ghetto liquidation. The immediate family had survived Strelnica and Mazowka intact. She related how immediately upon arrival in Auschwitz, she learned of the death of her father and brother, who had ridden in the ill-fated first car. A male friend of her sister explained that when the Judenrat stepped into the train at Strachowitz, the KL Sonderkommando, who had arrived in Strachowitz from the Majdanek concentration camp, aggressively forced its way into the same car. The heat and lack of circulation, sadly, in the closely packed car brought people close to suffocation. As some of the former Judenrat members were attempting to maneuver themselves into a less awkward standing position, individuals of the KL Sonderkommando began taunting. "Who do you think you're pushing around? What makes you think you're better than anyone else?" Tempers began to flare on both sides, until the KL Sonderkommando thundered, "All you pigs refuse to share your privileges with anyone except those who are willing and able to make you rich. We'll show you what big shots you are now." And fighting broke out. Father desperately attempted to calm the violence, only to incur the wrath of the KL Sonderkommando, who now turned on him. As her brother moved to defend her father, the ruffians began assaulting him too. The fight resulted in a number of fatalities, including her 44-year-old father and 16-year-old brother. Subsequently, 3 Strachowitz survivors giving videotaped testimony, and one writing his memoir, chose to mention the unusual number of deaths in the first train car, but attributed the fatalities to suffocation from lack of air. 5 testified that there was fighting and Jews killed one another or each other, and 2 specifically identified Wilczek as among the killed on the train. One of them described how Wilczek died. "They just stepped on him," she said. 6 testimonies, however, were quite specific that a revenge killing had occurred, a punishment for the misbehavior of the Jewish camp leadership, but were moot about the identity of the killers. The camp elite had been killed because they had been very bad in terms of beating and robbing other prisoners. They had incurred strong animosity because they had sold out their brothers. They had been so bad to the other prisoners that the latter took vengeance and choked them to death. One such witness raised the issue of the killers, but said that no one told who did it. 2 testimonies made clear that the revenge killings had not been perpetrated by Wiersbennickers. Rather, the killings were carried out by men from another town or a different camp. Finally, 3 of the videotaped testimonies confirmed Goldie Kalib's identification of the killers as the Kolneks from Majdanek, and another identified the killers as concentration camp prisoners, but wrongly identified them as having come from Plaszow. The fate of the Wilczek, Kotieri, and others at the hands of the Lubliners was also confirmed in 9 personal interviews. Almost all of these survivors related what they had learned from others immediately upon arrival in Auschwitz. The bodies of the dead were in plain sight as the Strachowitz Jews disembarked and marched past the first car. And the sensational news of how the deaths had occurred traveled very fast. Several of these witnesses were distressed that many innocent people had been killed alongside those who had most abused their powers. And one was emphatic that people from our town would never do it. only one among all the witnesses admitted to being in the first car and could confirm the offense as a direct eyewitness. As the Jews were being loaded onto the train in Strachowitz, Dena Rabinowitz spotted the Lubliners. I looked at these guys who had just arrived to our camp. They were pretty strong, yet they came from another place, another camp. I said, why don't I run with these guys? They look toughened up. Maybe they'll escape. I'll run with them. They stuck us in the wagon and sealed us up. Strong guys, pretty good sized boys. Wilczek, Rubinstein, and others of the camp elite were also in the car. They stuck us in there like sardines. That's when the commotion started. Fighting during the day, everybody tried to get a little bit of fresh air through the little window. They were pushing one another, getting angry. And then the killing began. Dena Rabinowitz arrived in Birkenau sitting on the pile of corpses. As a general rule, historians tend to prefer testimony that is given closer to the event to that given much later. But what is valid as a general rule is certainly not valid in the case of the fate of Jeremiah Wilczek and other camp leaders. Some events require a passage of time and the appropriate setting before witnesses are willing to speak. Clearly, the German investigation of Becker in the 1960s was not the propitious occasion, and the German judicial investigators were not suitable interviewers for Holocaust survivors to discuss this painful episode of internecine strife and revenge killing of Jews by Jews. By the 1990s, some 50 years after the fateful train ride to Birkenau, many of the Strachowitz survivors were willing to speak of these events not only among themselves as a communal memory, but now also to others as a public memory. In doing so, they have disproved yet another disparaging cliché about the Holocaust survivor testimony. That as time passes, it becomes more simplified and sanitized and divorced from the perplexing ambiguities and terrifying complexities of an increasingly distant time and place. Some speak with anger, and others with resignation, but many have spoken. The only voice that has not been heard is that of the Lubliners themselves, for whom this event still remains a communal rather than a public memory. If survivors had struggled with how and even whether to include the revenge killings of Wilczek and other prominent in their accounts, and a clear preponderance of evidence concerning Wilczek's fate did not emerge until rather recently, the ways in which survivors described their first impressions upon arrival in Birkenau are stunningly similar. The train arrived in the dark, and light penetrated the morning mist, only gradually. As the new arrivals first caught glimpses of scarecrow people with shaved heads, running around in striped pajamas and wrapped in blankets, one common image sprang to mind. In the identical words of no fewer than 10 survivors, they thought they had arrived in a crazy house. In the same spirit, 3 others pronounced it an insane asylum, 2 others a madhouse, and yet 2 others that it was filled with crazy people. This unity of initial reaction aside, what happened thereafter on the first day in Birkenau is recounted in significantly different ways. So far, I have argued that, overall, the core of shared memory of the Strachowitz survivors has proved relatively stable and reliable, despite the fact that the testimonies were given in the time span stretching over 6 decades. And as we have seen in the case of Wilczek and his fate on the train, there has been a growing tendency to speak more openly than before about sensitive or hitherto taboo topics. A chronological treatment of the history of Strachowitz factory slave laborers, however, requires me to end with precisely that episode. The arrival in Birkenau, about which survivor memory has proved increasingly problematic with the passage of time. In this case, however, another extremely important and complicating factor is at work. The factory slave labor camp is one of the most understudied and least well-known phenomena of the Holocaust. Among such camps, Strachowitz was both small and obscure. Except for those who were enslaved there, it is virtually unknown. For the historian, this has the significant advantage that survivor memories of Strachowitz are relatively pristine, uncontaminated by the later incorporation into individual memories of archetypal images broadly disseminated in popular consciousness. The arrival in Birkenau, on the other hand, is an extraordinarily dramatic, archetypal Holocaust memory, graphically described in some of the most widely read memoirs, such as Elie Wiesel's Night and Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, and visually portrayed in numerous documentaries and movies, most famously Schindler's List. How have the Strachowitz survivors withstood the tendency to incorporate into their own memories the powerful and pervasive images about the arrival in Birkenau, to which they had been exposed continuously in subsequent years? On one important count, the preponderance of testimony is quite convincing that the entry of Strachowitz transport into Birkenau was atypical. Because the transport came from a work camp that had already undergone numerous selections, the Strachowitz prisoners were brought into Auschwitz as a group without being subjected to the notorious selection on the ramp. Particularly those who were children or still had children in their family at the time were emphatic on this point. The unusual admission into Birkenau without selection was perhaps the single most crucial stroke of luck or act of fate in a long chain of fortuitous and unlikely events that enabled them to survive. In the words of one survivor, they were the luckiest transport. Two survivors surmised that the Germans did not work at the crematoria on Sunday, so they had been fortunately spared because of the day of the week on which they had arrived. Others conjectured that Germans were temporarily out of Zyklon B, or that the crematoria were full. Another survivor simply concluded that the Germans were not going to fire up the crematoria for a few kids. But for many, a less mundane, more miraculous explanation was needed. Hence, the story spread about the letter. According to this explanation, which several witnesses cautiously qualified as just a rumor, Baumgarten had intervened on behalf of his former prisoners and sent a letter with the transport assuring the authorities in Birkenau that the Strachowitz Jews were all good workers. This explanation took its most extreme form in the testimonies of two survivors, one of whom claimed that Baumgarten turned out after the war to have been a British secret agent, and the other that he was really a Jew who had successfully concealed his identity. More common than the elaboration of an explanation as to why no selection had taken place was the memory that the transport had indeed undergone selection. 33 survivors testified to this effect. All but one of these testimonies date from the 1980 and later. Perhaps not surprisingly, 16 survivors remember encountering the notorious Dr. Joseph Mengele on the ramp the morning of their arrival as part of the selection process. In one survivor testimony, a selection occurred not on the ramp, but after the showers, and it was conducted not by Mengele, but rather the equally infamous Adolf Eichmann. In my judgment, at least three factors are at work here. First, even among the witnesses who said there was no regular or systematic selection, are some who attested to certain selection-like occurrences that would have facilitated confusion of memory in this regard. Those who were too weak even to walk after disembarking from the train, were taken aside. Women and younger children were separated from the men and older boys before being shaved, showered, and tattooed. And some women and children were designated not to receive a tattoo immediately and were only tattooed several weeks later. Second, as mentioned above, the selection on the ramp by Dr. Mengele has become one of the most broadly recognized archetypal episodes of the Holocaust, widely disseminated in both books and films. Third, all of the Strachowitz prisoners who arrived in Birkenau were later subjected to the routine selections of the camp conducted by SS doctors, and Mengele, not infrequently, took part in those. Thus, the actual memory of the separation of the women and children from the men, the ex post facto incorporation of widely disseminated images, and the telescoping of the subsequent experience of selection by SS doctors, including the notorious and feared Dr. Mengele, with the arrival in Birkenau, experienced in a state of utter exhaustion and trauma, could all contribute to creating a vivid memory of something that actually had not occurred. In contrast, there is no convincing explanation, in my opinion, as to how a preponderance of witnesses could have arrived at the common memory of an atypical entry into Birkenau without the standard selection if this memory were false. Nor could such an assumption account for the empirical fact that so many of the women and children who would not have survived such a selection actually lived to testify to the contrary. The Strachowitz prisoners were taken from the ramp through the standard processing, where they were shaved, showered, tattooed, and given new camp clothing in place of the personal clothing they had worn before. According to the registration lists at Birkenau, 1,298 men and 409 women from the July 30 transport carrying Polish Jews from unnamed work camps in the Radom district received tattoo numbers. It is not certain if all of these 1,707 prisoners receiving numbers at the time were from Strachowitz. According to one source, additional train cars had been added to the transport in Czestochowa. As with the pattern of testimony of other Auschwitz survivors, the men made little comment about being shaved and given new clothes, but women were embarrassed by being forced to stand naked in front of male overseers, and then upset by their transformed appearance in ill-fitting clothing with shaved heads. The men had a different experience. While they were in a shower, old inmates came and asked whether there were any Jewish policemen among them, and whether they had behaved badly. At first, the new arrivals did not understand the purpose of the question, but then they realized that the old inmates had come to settle scores. Sasha Langelblum, who apparently had not traveled in the ill-fated first train car, was identified and badly beaten. But, unlike Wilczek and other prominenten, he survived. Apparently seeing the feared and hated Langelblum being beaten was not a source of gratification, but rather a demonstration of the newcomers' utter powerlessness in their new surroundings. Pinchas Hochmik commented that the episode brought our morale even lower. Another aspect of the entry into camps, in addition to the selection on the ramp by Mengele, demonstrates the powerful capacity of popular media, especially film, to implant images and shape the way in which stories are retold. Before 1990, only one testimony, that of Joseph Koz from 1948, told how upon arrival in Birkenau, the Strachowitz prisoners did not dare to have hope until water rather than gas came from the shower heads. This must have been a not uncommon experience, yet it does not again appear in the testimonies for nearly 50 years. Then, after the remarkable shower scene in Schindler's List had become an iconic image of the Holocaust, no fewer than 20 survivors include in their narratives a reference to their surprise or relief when the showers proved to be real, and water, rather than gas, came from the shower heads. Following the entry processing, the Strachowitz prisoners were moved to one part of the so-called Gypsy Camp, or Zigeunerlager, which contained Roma and Sinti, who had been deported from Germany to Birkenau in 1943 and placed under quarantine. After the trauma of the train trip and entry, they were exhausted and hungry. But one aspect of their new setting struck many of them immediately. In comparison with Strachowitz, Birkenau was very clean, and there were no lice. As one survivor put it, this was the good thing, but quickly added, only in that way. The last common experience of the Strachowitz prisoners before they were dispersed to various camps, barracks, and work commandos of the vast Auschwitz-Birkenau complex following quarantine came several days later, on the night of August 2nd, 1944. They had briefly observed the Gypsy family camp as their neighbors, and some had talked through the fence that separated their quarantine barracks from the Gypsies. But that night, they heard trucks rolling in and out of the Gypsy camp, as well as screaming and crying. The Gypsies, well aware of their impending fate, did not go quietly. The next morning, the Gypsy camp was entirely empty, and the Strachowitz newcomers could see the smoke belching from the crematoria and smell the stench of burning flesh and hair that filled the air. They had been temporarily spared, but they had now seen how Birkenau could devour nearly 3,000 people in a single night. And that concludes chapter 24 of Remembering Survival in a Nazi Slave Labor Camp by Christopher R. Browning. If you would like to catch the previous 23 chapters, there's a link in my Instagram bio that'll take you to a playlist on YouTube where you can listen to all the previously recorded ones of this book. This chapter that we just read will go up tomorrow afternoon, and I will continue to read the chapters at 9 p.m. Central Time during weekdays. I'm Carter Banks, and thanks for listening.